ago, there was a show, an episode on one of the TV channels, and it was labeled "Unwelcomed: The Muslim Next Door." And recently, there have been a lot of talks about Muslims being not welcomed anywhere, whether it's because they wanted to build a new masjid, whether because they're moving somewhere. But there's a lot of talk in the media about how Muslims are not wanted. So we take a look at why this is happening. And a lot of times we'll think that, okay, this has something to do with people being ignorant and not really knowing the truth about Islam, or not understanding what Islam is. And that's something they have to take the blame for. They have to do part of understanding the truth. They have to do the research. But the majority of the fault on this comes upon us as Muslims on two main points. The first one is, what have we done to prove to them otherwise? Because when somebody tells you you're not welcome next door, they have a perception in their mind that you're bad for whatever reason. So one, what have we done to prove them otherwise? And then two, what have we done to make them have that thought, to make them think that Muslims are bad? Similarly, the story that happened a few years ago, when we had all these drawings of the Prophet ﷺ and all these mockings of how he was presented to Islam or to the world. How the Prophet was presented as a terrorist. How he was presented as a bad person. And when we think about it, we realize that the reason why people thought of him that way, because they didn't have any other way of thinking of him. We, as Muslims, did not present the Prophet ﷺ the way we should have been. So the minute somebody came up and said, these are his characters, people had nothing else to compare him to. So they said, okay, that must be him. Because all what we know is what we hear from the media. Now, yeah, they should have done more research, but they didn't. But also, we didn't do our part. So we have to think about, how are we presenting Islam to non-Muslims? How are we dealing with Islam? And how are we dealing with non-Muslims? Because when non-Muslims look at us, they don't look at only individuals. They don't look at me as an employee at a certain company, or as a teacher, or as a business owner. But they also associate Islam with everything I do. So what I do is a reflection of Islam in front of all these people. Now let's look at why people have that perception. Because remember, we talked about they have responsibility of having that misconception, but we also have the bigger part. And we have to take the responsibility on ourselves. So the first thing when we look at, we realize that when we deal with non-Muslims, we tend to use bad habits, or we tend to do things that are against Islam. And I'll give you a perfect example that happened right before my eyes. There was a Muslim manager, and he had a non-Muslim worker working for him. So somebody called for the manager. The manager was standing right there. He said, tell them I'm not here. And he just lied right there. So now that gives the people the perception that, okay, it is okay to lie. That us Muslims, we are lying. Having to lie is nothing big in our book. So they say, okay, so Muslims lie, and then we cheat. Whether we want to admit it or not, every time we're trying to do business with others, we have the mentality that if we cheat them, that we're doing good for ourselves. As long as I can get away with it, then that's okay. And we think that people don't notice these things. We think people don't add up that, okay, well, Muslims lie, Muslims cheat, Muslims talk bad, Muslims drink. So how are they different than anybody else. I mean, these are the things that start adding up when we're building the character of Muslims. It's not very hard to tell 80% or 70% of Muslims when they're walking around. You know, even if you're not Muslim, people will associate you with Muslims. If anybody looks like a Middle Eastern descent, yeah, he must be a Muslim. Anybody with a beard? Yeah, sure, he's a Muslim too. So even though when we're not paying attention to it, people are watching our actions. So when something comes up, people will say, yeah, sure, I know. It is true. Muslims are bad. They cheat, they lie, they do everything. So looking at all of these things, so the first thing we have to do is we have to contradict all these bad things. We have to learn how to be honest. And this doesn't come overnight. If you lived with a habit for years, for 10, 15, your whole life, grew up thinking that those little lies don't count, it's going to take you more than a day or more than a week to think. But we have to start somewhere. We have to start changing ourselves. So when people look at Muslims, they say, oh, they are good. Yeah, sure, what they are presenting about them in the media is wrong. And then the simplest thing we can do is be nice to our neighbors. And the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man kana yu'min billahi wal yawm al-akhir, falyukrim jara." Whoever believes in Allah on Judgment Day, just let him be generous to his neighbor. And this is so simple. And yet sometimes it's so hard for us to do. And think about it, among your neighbors, whether you live in an apartment or you live in a house, how many neighbors do you know? How many neighbors do you just know their names? Not even just know them, but just know their first names. And how many have you visited? You know, these are the things that we have to start practicing so we can building that relationship with them. And then another problem is that we tend to isolate ourselves from the rest of the community. We don't participate in any community events. We don't participate in any events that happen in our neighborhood. And the first thing that comes to mind is, well, I don't want to be influenced by them. You know, some of them drink or eat pork. And that's perfectly okay, that we don't want that. What we want is we want to have a relationship with the good that they have. You know, let's establish that relationship on what we have in common. You know, when was the last time we invited our neighbors to dinner? Or when was the last time we had our kids play together? You know, sometimes people worry that, you know, I don't want their kids, or I don't want them to influence me in a bad way. But why can't we think, why don't we influence them in what we do? Why don't we influence them with being truthful, with being honest, with being nice, and teach them the manners of Islam? Because this is what will get the ball going with having that relationship established. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Hujurat verses 13, He said, يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسُ إِنَّا خَلَقْنَاكُم مِّن ذَكَرٍ وَأُنثَىٰ وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا. He said, O mankind, O people, we have created you from man and woman and made you into nations and tribes so you can get to know each other. Now see what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala started the verse with. Ya ayyuhan nas, O people. He didn't say, O those who worship me. He didn't say, O those who believe. He said, people. We are part of the people. They are part of the people. And he didn't say only know the believers, or only get to know the people who worship, or only know Muslims. No, he said get to know each other. Present Islam to them the right way. And then, after we have established these these reports and these relationships, we will be able to protect ourselves from the bad influence of the media. Because at that point, if something comes up, these people will say, no, Muhammad is my neighbor, and he would never do this. Or, Sumayya is my neighbor, and she would never do this. And again, I'll tell you a perfect story. It happened right after September 11th. A man I know very well was at a job. Now, he had, good relations with the people that he worked with. They knew he was a Muslim, but he practiced it right. And he practiced his characteristics of a Muslim's right. And then right after September 11th happened, a lot of talk happened. And really many people got upset about him and went and took him to HR. Now that person really didn't have to say much. Guess who came to his defense? All the non-Muslims, all the Americans that were around him. They said, no, he would never do this. We know him, we've known him for so many years. And what the media says is wrong. Now look at this example, just perfect example. And all what that guy had to do was just be a good Muslim, practice Muslim to its potential. Just the basics. Wallahi, he didn't do anything special. Just presented Islam the way it was. So when we look at the media for the most part presents Islam or presents us in a bad way for two main reasons. Either for political reasons or for religious reasons. But then why do we allow them to do that to us? Why don't we, be proactive and not do anything? We don't have to go to the media and say, I want you to present Islam in a good way, or you're presenting Islam in the wrong way. No, all we have to do is just practice what Islam tells us. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will do the rest. Recently an article was published in the Cincinnati Enquirer about how Muslims are participating in feeding the hungry and helping the homeless here in Cincinnati. And I swear I had people calling me, telling me, hey, I saw this story about Muslims helping the homeless. People I haven't talked to in years. Now, did Muslims plan for this to happen? No. It was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who did it. But all we had to do was just do our part. And what was it that we had to do? Wallahi, nothing. We just had to do a very minimal work and just help the few people. Now, don't mind the fact of the impact that was done on those homeless people and how Islam was presented to them among the others that were around. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took this and said, okay, this is how we present Islam, and made it spread. Now if somebody came and told you Muslims don't care about homelessness, people will say, no, I have the proof. Look, they participate, they do, they help. And then we have to look at, again, why is Islam misrepresented? Sometimes it's because we don't understand it ourselves. We don't understand certain things that people will take and use in a bad way. And the examples are many. And we'll just use few. And the first one is how women are presented, or how women are treated in Islam. And how they tell you men are superior in Islam over women. And I know I've been asked this question so many times. And a lot of times what we fall under is we don't know how to answer this question right. So we give them the wrong answer, and they take the wrong impression. So let's understand Islam ourselves, so when we're asked, we know how to present it. We know how to answer those simple questions. And wallahi, when you think about the questions that Muslims are asked on a regular basis, are very few. They'll ask you about alcohol. They'll ask you about marriage. They'll ask you about how women are treated, women's rights. I mean, you can count them. So how hard is it for us to just look at those questions and just do basic research on what's the best way to answer those questions? Because it's not the first time that you or I are going to be asked those questions. So let's be prepared on how we're going to answer them. And then, this is the point that really scares me the most. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He does not put anybody in the hellfire except unless a message has been come to them. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not punish those who did not believe in Him until a messenger or the message of Islam has been delivered to them. And a lot of people will think these days that, yeah, you know, media is all around us. People hear about Islam. But what if we are presenting Islam the wrong way? What if we are the reason why people didn't come to Islam? Because we came across a non-Muslim and we cheated him or her. Or we treated them bad. Or we lied to them. So they say, that's the Islam I don't want. I don't want this religion. Now in our mind, we did deliver that message. But we delivered it the wrong way. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will tell us that you presented Islam the wrong way. So then we get part of that punishment. So we really have to be careful of how we are presenting Islam because we are responsible for it. قولوا قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم. I ask God. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على أشرف خلق الله سيدنا محمد صلوات الله وسلامه عليه. Dear brothers and sisters, we have a responsibility and we have to take ownership of how we present Islam to people. When the media portrays Muslims are bad, it happens for a reason. We have to take responsibility and stepping up to the plate and say, I'm going to start presenting Islam the way it should be. I'm going to establish relationships with my non-Muslim friends. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ordering us to do this. He's telling us, I've created you from the different nations and tribes so you can get to know each other. He didn't say separate the communities. So let's establish that relationship with our neighbors. Let's start with our friends at work. Let's have just at least one non-Muslim friend so they can see Islam. And believe me, people talk. If something happens, people will say, well, you know, I have a Muslim friend who is good, or she is good and she doesn't do this and that. So we start creating people that will defend Islam without us having to say anything. It is our actions that speak, not our mouths.